and welcome to Legislative Report. I'm Laurie Bull, and here today is Representative Bryan Cutler, and you're here to give us a little bit of an update on the budget and what's going on with that process and where we're at. It's kind of been an unusual year for the budget, so I guess to start off, can you just briefly, in a sentence or two maybe, walk us through what a typical year's budget process looks like and how it goes from the beginning to the end?
Sure. Normally, most folks are probably most familiar with the budget process starting with the governor's address. That happens the first Tuesday in February. And then there's about 3 or 4 weeks of budgetary hearings that run in the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees. That normally brings us up into April, May, and June, when the budget discussions between the House, the Senate, and the governor really begin in earnest. However, as you pointed out, this year has been very different than in prior years. In fact, when you look at what has happened so far, this budget process actually started at the end of last session. Our caucus recognized the difficult financial position we would be in terms of the Commonwealth revenues going forward. At that point, we were missing revenues, but they certainly accelerated heading into April. So the goal was really to start the process much sooner, even before the governor gave his address, so that we would have a strong foundation of legislative proposals ready to roll. And we began that in November and December of last year. And by April the 4th, we actually passed a budget out of the House, and it went to the Senate at that time. And then by the end of April through May and June, we passed a host of other revenue options that would have funded that budget. At that time, the budget funded all of the essential portions of government: public health, safety and welfare, and education, and it was balanced.
Now, when Governor Wolf proposed his budget in February, what did you see? How did it differ from the direction maybe that the House Republican caucus wanted to go?
Well, one of the things that the House Republicans have been talking about, as well as many other folks here in Harrisburg about, is the cost drivers as we go forward. Whether you look at the amount of debt that our Commonwealth has, or the areas of the budget that are growing so fast that it actually eats up quicker than the rate of increase in terms of revenue going forward, which is really what has been happening over probably the last 8 to 10 years. Because of a variety of circumstances, some of them under our control, some of them not. It really has impacted our ability to grow revenue. When you look at our Commonwealth, the fastest growing age demographic is those age 80 and older, and yet we're losing folks in the 24 to 59 age bracket. Those are your prime working years, and those are also your prime tax-paying years. So when you look at what we're losing, we're really losing our tax base as we go forward. And we're projected to lose potentially up to another 100,000 individuals in that prime working age group heading into the next census. So that will be very difficult and will continue to be an issue as we go forward. So because of that, we've taken a variety of positions to try to reduce our debt payments going forward. We've also looked at areas such as Medicaid reform. As many folks might recall, the governor unilaterally expanded Medicaid earlier in the month. He admitted that that is about a $300 million increase. That's a substantial portion of the whole. And $300 million is a lot of money to come up with, so we must take a look at those programs, figure out which programs are working, and then make the necessary changes to help bend those cost curves going forward.
Going back to the process again, usually when a budget's passed in June, there's a spending plan that's passed that says this is what we're spending our money on, and then there's a revenue bill that's passed that says this is where that money is coming from, the money that we're going to use and spend, this is how we're going to get it. However, this time in June, a spending plan was passed, but no bill to dictate where that money was coming from. Can you talk about the efforts of your caucus to suggest options for revenue? There were a number of proposals, and it's just been a constant discussion, but there have been ideas generated, and they just haven't quite passed the goal line, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, not only have there been ideas generated, there have actually been a multitude of bills that have passed the House. Regardless of where you're at on the underlying policy issues, there was a gaming expansion bill that passed the first week in June. There were liquor privatization efforts that passed April, May, and June. Those both would raise several $100 million potentially, depending on what portions or if they would be implemented in their entirety. Additionally, we've looked at simplifying and closing some of our tax loopholes. That continues to be part of the discussion. And then there was a large effort through the summer and then ultimately a vote in September to take a look at a variety of surplus accounts that are currently sitting around different government agencies, that many of which have not been used. And some are programs that are even no longer funded, yet the money is still sitting there. And to give a little bit of context, there's about $12 billion sitting in a little over 400 accounts. We took 40 of those accounts and proposed transferring about $600 million of true surplus into the operating funds, as well as we brought up the issue of should we look at the revenue that goes into those funds, because some of these funds have been on autopilot for decades. And they've always gotten a certain percentage of a certain revenue stream, and maybe that number made sense when the programs were initiated. But I think the taxpayers expect us to take a look at that and make sure that the numbers in terms of the revenue coming in and expenses going out still match. And when they don't, these accounts build surpluses. I think it's fair to say nobody thinks that burying little mason jars of money in your backyard is a good investment plan. And I think doing the same in government accounting is really just bad public policy. Taxpayers expect us to use the money that we've already collected in the most efficient manner possible, and that's not letting it sit idle in a variety of tax hoarding accounts, basically, is what they've really become. I mean, hoarding taxpayer dollars in these accounts is not good for the constituents, it's not good for the programs, and it's not good for the programs that actually need the money. And nothing protects the environment if it's sitting in an account that not hasn't been accessed and isn't being used. And if we're not using it to increase farmland preservation, or we're not using it to create additional green space or other environmental initiatives or coal mine cleanup, whatever the cause might be, I think we absolutely should use it to fund the DEP in order to work so that they can protect the environment and not let it sit idle in these accounts.
So all these efforts and different proposals, they're all kind of working toward that goal of standing up for the taxpayers and trying to not increase that tax load on our constituents. Is that how you would view it?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at a variety of the issues that we've looked at over the years, I think it's fair to say that raising taxes should be the last, hurdle that you clear. The first one should be, is the money that we're already collecting being used wisely? And then are the programs that we're funding, are they actually working? And then if and when that you're convinced that you're getting all of the best use out of all of the tax money that we're already collecting, then you can have a discussion about new revenues going forward. But what we're not hearing is, how do you control the costs? How do you make sure that Medicaid costs don't continue to climb beyond what the rate of inflation is? How do you make sure that our debt payments don't continue to go up? I mean, in a $32 billion budget, we're paying over $1 billion in general obligation debt, and that's a large portion. I mean, that's the money that we borrowed is money that can't be spent on schools, can't be spent on roads and bridges, can't be spent in a variety of other areas that we should be focusing on. And I think it's time that we do a top to bottom review on all of these accounts, figure out which ones work, which ones don't, and then prioritize them accordingly.
So would you say then it's kind of a philosophical difference that's kind of keeping things from moving forward and getting a resolution on this?
Not necessarily philosophical. I think it comes from a different starting point.
Okay.
Many of the folks in the House, when we were out talking with constituents, obviously we have much smaller districts than the governor who covers the whole state, so we have a lot more personal contact with folks. And I've heard from plenty of folks, if you need to raise my taxes, I won't be happy, but I could understand. Probably the best example would be the gas tax, with the gasoline tax and the roads and the bridges that it's currently funding. I provide an update there on a weekly basis of all the construction projects that were enabled because of that. And folks, while they weren't pleased, certainly understood that all of the other options had in fact been exhausted before we go into that. I'm not sure that the residents and the constituents, and I've not heard from them, that say, we think you're doing a great job in all these other programs, so it is time to raise taxes. They're still stuck on steps 1 and 2. They want us to look at the money that we're already collecting and look at the programs that we're already funding. And that, I think, is something that we would hopefully all agree on.
Now, the treasurer took a step in September to delay payments on some loans and things like that. Did that step need to be taken, or what's your
Absolutely
thought?
not. When you look at what the treasurer did, I mean, it was really a bunch of political theater. Leading up to that, he had picked an arbitrary date in September and said after this date, he did not deem the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to be a prudent investment. And yet, within a couple days, 3 days later, he immediately reissued the loans. And in the interim since then, he's also said he'll once again issue a short-term loan. Remember, this all goes back to the $12 billion that's sitting in these special accounts, all these restricted accounts. That's the money that he's loaning to the Commonwealth on a short-term basis. That money is clearly there because he's been loaning it to us for years. And to kind of build the political pressure and then not pay bills, which resulted in a bond downgrade, that is just poor financial management on behalf of the Commonwealth. And when you look at the two reports, the one leading into and then the one after the bond downgrade, the only thing that changed between those two reports really was the fact that the bills weren't paid. That ultimately comes back to he and the governor making the decision not to do so, even though the money was there.
Okay. So status update, where are we now in the process? What does it mean for Pennsylvania? Should Pennsylvanians be concerned or worried that there'll be another downgrade or that schools won't get money?
Well, I think when you look forward, again, we still have the revolving line of credit that the treasurer has temporarily extended. I would like to see that get outside the realm of the political games that's currently being played there. And when you look forward, though, talks are still going on. We were engaged in them over the weekends on particulars regarding the different bills and the transfers and the different components of the budget. The House is in session this week. Obviously, I would love to send everything to the Senate and have everything go to the governor. That would be probably the best resolution, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, we have to work within the realm of 102 votes in the House, 26 in the Senate, and hopefully one with the governor. So I would certainly welcome a little more input from the executive branch. That really has been sporadic at best as we go forward, and I would hope that they'd be a little more engaged.
Any closing comments as we wrap up here?
Well, I think it's important for folks to recognize that when you look at the budget and everything that's contained in it, as well as the way we fund it, the approach there really, I think, is one that we all really bring from home. It's the idea that you don't spend more than you bring in. And when you budget something and you don't spend all of it, you don't hide it somewhere in a governmental account. You bring it back online, you reappropriate it. You know, if you or I were going to buy a new kitchen table, we budgeted $800, but we found one on a 50% sale at $400. You don't leave that $400 sit in your kitchen table account. And we really have to get back to running our state finances very similar to the way we run our own at home.
Well, I want to thank you so much for giving this update and for continuing to stand up for the taxpayers and to try to work toward this solution, and hopefully we'll come to one soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you have any questions for Representative Cutler on the budget or any other state matter, feel free to contact him at his district office or through his website. You can also find him on Facebook. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.